Through the dense clouds, the alien ships could be seen, their metallic surfaces shining in the sunlight. As the high command on board the planet approached the Earth's surface, it appeared rudimentary, basic, and simple to according to conquest accounts. Humankind lacked superior technology comparable to their own. It was only another backward planet would like to add another planet to their growing empire. This would be a brief campaign they considered before it started, so when they landed in the middle of the jungle, they anticipated a rapid march to victory. The deep, lush, and green jungle looked. Yet the aliens saw it as just another obstacle and didn't care because they had their machines, weapons, and strategies, none of which the humans could ever hope to match. The sleek, armored alien commanders encircled by their soldiers with superior technology were utterly contemptuous of what was ahead. Armed with sophisticated weaponry and sensors that could scan the forest, the soldiers boldly marched off the ship. With every step they took, their precise calculations and data guided them into the dense foliage. They thought their equipment was built to survive any terrain, or at least that's what they were promised. They would easily handle anything the bush threw at them because they were superior in every manner, but the jungle had other ideas. The aliens hadn't taken into consideration the extreme humidity for their suits, which were made for a different climate. Dampness leaked into the circuits and the environment started to malfunction, causing their heads-up displays to darken and the sensors to flicker initially. This was only a small annoyance. The commanders gave the order for the soldiers to advance farther, dismissing it as a temporary solution. The further they ventured into the forest, the more the environment retaliated, with vines entwined around their limbs and dense their development to a crawling insect unlike anything the aliens had before witnessed swarmed around them. The alien warriors biting into their flesh and seeping inside their armor attempted to brush them away, but the bugs persisted in their buzzing and biting, irritating the soldiers. Increased to the point where the jungle started to establish itself as more than just an environment was a power unto itself, and each advancement became an effort. It seemed like every stride brought with it new difficulties and barriers that no amount of sophisticated technology could conquer. The alien leaders became irate and began yelling at their soldiers to advance more quickly in order to cut through the trying to disregard the insects. They continued to think that this was just another straightforward task they could finish. They understood as they chopped their way through the dense vegetation that, despite their best efforts, the jungle was unforgiving. That their food and water supplies, which they had thought would be plenty for a rapid fix, were running low, far quicker than anticipated. The mission was running out due to the intense heat. Sweat trickled down their faces from the strain of constantly having to battle through the bush. Visage, their formerly disciplined ranks started to deteriorate, and the alien commander still denied the existence of the true issue, thinking it was a passing glitch, something that, once they were at their objective, would soon be rectified, but the location appeared to be shifting. Every step they went, the jungle was getting farther away and more unforgiving, consuming them whole, rendering their scanners and maps useless as they noticed that the terrain was altering and shifting. Before they could even keep track of it, alien warriors started muttering, which was one of the earliest indicators of panic. Taking apprehensive looks at each other and the thick woodland, their armor once buffed and sparkling was now covered in muck and leaves, and the unwavering character of the situation had undermined their confidence. In the jungle, several soldiers staggered while others fell behind, but the commanders urged them forward, refusing to concede the fight, and the first victim appeared. The soldier vanished from the woods in an instant, having only been walking for a moment. Ate him up silently, causing panic to spread among the commanders caught off guard attempted to regain control, but the soldiers arrived too late. Were tense, their nerves strained by the environment's continual assault, and they started to understand that they weren't under charge of this forest. The leaders attempted to reorganize in order to rally their troops. But nothing could halt the mounting disquiet because the jungle was real and was retaliating. In ways they hadn't foreseen, the terrain itself turned into a root enemy, and the aliens were once so certain of their superiority that they sent soldiers to Earth, yet the vines seemed to move on their own. Superiority were now powerless against an unknown force, and as night descended, the woods grew much more. The soldiers' night vision equipment failed, making it risky because the darkness was dense and impenetrable. Yet they could still hear the noises of the creatures living in the jungle, leaves rustling, insects buzzing, but they were blind. Everything turned become a potential threat. Every stir indicated an approaching danger. Danger there was nowhere to flee as the jungle encircled them. Now in a desperate state, the alien leaders instructed their soldiers to establish a barrier in the hopes of repelling the intruder. Nonetheless, the forest moved without regard for their defenses or weaponry, silently advancing, engulfing more soldiers as the night wore on. For the first time, the aliens started to grasp the magnitude of their error. This was a war of survival, not one they could win with brute force. And by dawn, the jungle was winning because fewer people were living there, had taken more lives in the shadows, leaving the survivors tired, confused, and afraid of the alien commanders in the midst of a planet they were unable to dominate, having earlier believed in their own invincibility. Nothing about their strategies, technology, or confidence mattered in this. Something moved in the distance, just beyond their reach. It moved too quickly for them to see fully, but it was there, observing. The aliens were unsure if they were prepared to face the surprises that the forest has in store for them as they waited. Even though the battle was just getting started, the aliens had already lost their most powerful tool, their confidence in themselves. Supremacy. The forest was alive, and when the alien warriors approached, it was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. As they went farther into the bush, their weariness was evident, and each step they took felt more difficult than the sun's long shadows were spread across the last portion of the heavy canopy above. Thick foliage, the dampness and unrelenting heat gave them the impression that they were wading through water. Every breath was labored rather than being light, and not even the most orderly of them, the alien commanders, who were still attempting to retain authority, began to lose their composure and were giving commands to continue. But the feedback wasn't as positive as it had before been. Flawless. The formation had dispersed, with each soldier more focused on getting by for the next few steps than as the quest progressed. The noises of the jungle persisted: birds, insects, and odd calls they weren't able to identify. But there was also another sound. Something was unsettling them. It was not quite like, but it was almost too quiet. Something was observing them while the alien warriors, with all of their advanced training, waited for the appropriate moment to sense something they weren't prepared for. Fear, and the forest started to transform. What began as inconvenient vines and underbrush turned against them in more direct ways. Hostile-appearing plants entangled themselves around their legs, further slowing down their mobility and covering the ground below. They couldn't understand why they felt less stable, as if the earth itself was moving. But nothing about this place made sense. That the forest was evolving into a live, breathing environment rather than merely a place. Adversaries' equipment, which was made for all terrains, was suddenly deteriorating alarmingly quickly. Guns that were meant to communication equipment were jamming in order to easily get past obstructions and were losing signal, as if the air itself was preventing their transmissions. Previously, they had been told that their technician would take care of everything. They weren't fighting. Instead, they were being betrayed by the same tools they relied on in this strange wilderness. Initially arrogant and self-assured, the extraterrestrial warriors were now ready to cope with. They had arrived with a clear mission, but they couldn't have predicted disarray. Now, that mission was disintegrating in front of them, making it difficult for them to determine how far they had traveled, or worse still, how long it would take them to arrive at their destination. Had no idea who or what was out there, but they could all feel a little change in the atmosphere. Location, but it was sufficient to cause them to tighten their grips on their weapons as the first real indications of panic began to appear. Their guns turned dark and sensors produced erroneous readings due to equipment failure. Despite nothing showing up on their sensors, some soldiers even claimed they could see movement in the shadows. One of their own had vanished without warning. It happened too quickly for anybody to respond. The soldier, one moment he was there leading the others in a march, and the next he had disappeared into the den. Without any noise or effort, the gang simply vanished and froze, staring at one another. Their superiors yelled at them to remain focused, not knowing what had just happened, but it was obvious that they too were starting to question their own ability to handle the situation. The jungle was doing more than just slowing them down. It was actively pursuing them as more soldiers started to fall behind and the distance between them widened in the chaos. With no trace, the larger jungle engulfed the remaining survivors, leaving the others to speculate as to whether they would be next. Couldn't remain motionless, but every step forward felt as perilous. The alien commanders attempted to restore order as if it were their last. However, despite their best efforts, the deadly fear spread quickly, outpacing their ability to confine the soldiers. Started firing into the bush mindlessly at the first noise. They had no notion what they were aiming at, but it was sufficient to give them a sense of power over the bush, however brief. Didn't need to react to their gunfire because it had already made a claim. More of them than they knew, and as darkness struck, the work wasn't over yet. As the temperature dropped and the humidity persisted, making everything seem sticky, the situation got even worse. And unbearable, the night vision equipment of the extraterrestrial soldiers was completely dark, hard to see through the heavy fog that appeared to float in the air, making visibility limited to a few feet. The whispers appeared in any direction at first, but they were hesitant, sounding similar to other sounds in the jungle, but they became more loud and clear, as if something or someone was the whispers circled, conversing in a language they couldn't understand and just outside the reach of their diminishing vision. The leaders wrote off their shifting from side to side within the organization as paranoia, but the soldiers sensed that the jungle was alive and ongoing. And they knew better. Playing with them, but their nerves were already frazzled and some of them broke. Soldiers, in a last-ditch effort to flee the unseen menace, broke formation entirely and ran into the darkness. Didn't last long since the bush silently took them one by one. The remaining soldiers were horrified to see their friends disappear into the night, captured by something they couldn't quite comprehend. Observe, and after that the assault started gradually with basic traps, formed from the actual jungle, including trenches that opened up, branches that dropped from above, and vines that snapped like whips. These hazards beneath their feet weren't there by accident, they had been purposefully placed there. The soldiers attempted to strike back with precision from something that was considerably more familiar with the jungle than they were, but their numbers were quickly decreasing and their weaponry were ineffective against the terrain itself, but there was no opportunity to regroup. They were being targeted, and the alien commanders knew they were at this point. There was nothing they could do to stop it. Were losing command, their troops were dispersed, their technology was breaking down, and despite their broken spirits, the jungle continued to prevail in this conflict without ever revealing its identity. There was still no indication of the adversary. Humans were thought to be feeble, primitive beings incapable of this degree of strategy or stealth, yet they were being observed by someone or something outside. The thought of laying traps and utilizing the jungle as the ultimate weapon dawned on me. Like a kick to the gut, they realized that this was more than simply a mission, it was a survival. And they were losing as the guerrilla warrior went stealthily through the jungle, going unobserved by the alien invaders. He had been observing them for days, analyzing their tendencies and vulnerabilities, as these creatures with all their haughtiness and sophisticated technology were out of place here. The jungle was his territory. And he had spent the majority of his life battling intruders in jungles before. When these aliens first arrived, he had to deal with adversaries who misjudged both the land and him, but nobody misjudged it for a long time. The jungle was a living thing. And he understood how to exploit it to his every plant, sound, and shadow that came his way was advantageous. The fighter's hard training had been developed in the most inhospitable places, and throughout the most difficult fights the fighter had ever served as a soldier in a conflict that appeared to never end. But this time he was alone, and the stakes were higher. Protecting the very thing was more important than simply surviving. The jungle, which he called home, was his ally, and the two of them were unbeatable. The alien warriors relied on technology and data that told them where they were because they had no idea what was coming for them, where to go and what to do, but in the jungle instincts, that information was meaningless. It mattered more than machines, and the warrior was aware of this. The first thing he did was use it against them. Done was upset their equilibrium as he observed them fighting the heat, insects, and visible vegetation. The growing anger among them, and he was certain that soon anger would give way to dread because fear was such a strong emotion. Weapon 1, which he would employ to the utmost degree, started with modest acts of sabotage, items that they would not immediately notice, such a broken vine here or a misplaced rock there, just enough to slow them along. Down, make them doubt each move they made, since he understood how to blend in with the jungle and become invisible. The aliens were unaware that he was observing and waiting until he was certain they were on edge. He proceeded to the following stage, where the traps were basic but efficient. Didn't require anything complicated because the jungle had all the instruments he required. A pit concealed by greenery and equipped with sharp spikes that are set to collapse when triggered as a fallen tree. The purpose of the traps, which included leaves and branches, was to generate dread rather than to kill people instantly. The first trap went off without a hitch, and the aliens realized they weren't safe. Steed was stepped into a pit by an extraterrestrial soldier, and as he fell onto the jagged spikes below, the ground gave way. The subsequent cry terrified the remaining soldiers, who fumbled with their rifles and looked around in fear. Directions, but they were unable to see their adversary, so they were unsure of the attack's origin or when it would occur. Once more, The guerrilla fighter saw the soldiers frantically trying to do what he desired from a distance. Regroup, despite their best efforts to keep things in order, they were yelling at one another and clearly losing it. Fighter grinned to himself, unaware of what was truly happening to them. It must have appeared as though the jungle was assaulting them directly. Maintained his onslaught, hitting them with a well-placed stone that slid down a slope and triggered a chain reaction. Response that caused a wall of plants to collapse over them. Another soldier went into a deceptively concealed alien commander's growled commands as Ward was left hanging from a tree after snaring his foot and pulling him up. But they were losing control. They understood they were outside of their comfort zone. The fighter moved silently and undetected through the jungle, moving through he never stayed in one place instead. Every step he took was precisely measured. Kept the aliens guessing that they might have had superior technology for much too long. But here in this jungle didn't matter, experience did, and he possessed more of it than they could ever hope to. In match, he could see that they were beginning to lose their shape and were furious. The alien warriors were suffocating them in the woods, and he was only getting started. It was just what they needed to be on edge, shooting their weapons into the trees at every sound, wasting valuable energy and resources. Fear the fighter wasn't in a haste. He knew how to cause mayhem and confusion. The longer he kept the aliens off balance, the more blunders he made. Practice patience and let the forest handle the majority of the work. He was certain that they would make mistakes, and that he would be there to take advantage of them when they did. He was aware that although the aliens were attempting to contact for reinforcements, their communication systems were the thick vegetation and continuous interference from the forest ensured that they were unreliable in this setting. Were cruelly shut off from any assistance, and the combatant meant for it to stay that way. Once night fell once more. The alien warriors made the jungle even more perilous. Snuggled together, attempting to strengthen their position, but the darkness made it ineffective. Was his ally, and he was skilled at using it as they scrambled in the dark. Moved easily since his eyes had been accustomed to the dim light. The aliens, on the other hand, could see every inch of the terrain when he approached their camp in silence. The soldiers stood guard in shifts, always alert, but their alertness was waning due to tiredness. Terror was taking hold, and he could see it in their stance and the way they were holding their weapons. He struck again, more forcefully this time, causing them to become weak as a result of their fear. Another alien soldier was down in a flash after a swift strike from the woods, giving the others little time to respond. The soldiers fired aimlessly into the trees before he vanished once more, vanishing into the jungle like a ghost. However, they had nothing to strike since the fighter had already moved on to his next target, the guerrilla fighter. Wasn't only battling to survive, he was also declaring that this giant was his. The aliens, regardless of how sophisticated their technology was, had no business being here. This area was too wild and unpredictable for them to conquer, no matter how powerful their weapons were, and he was the one who had the ability to manage it. The aliens were losing more than simply warriors. Their formerly exact actions had become chaotic, and they were losing their minds. The fighter was taking them more into the woods, and their attempts to retake control were fruitless. Grasps the alien commanders this was his fight, and he was winning. Their breaking point, their dispersed armies, their faulty weapons, and their numbers declining, they were fighting their own battles rather than just the environment. Dread that the guerrilla fighter remained elusive despite their best attempts, attacking whenever they pleased and disappearing before the aliens attempted to reorganize and establish temporary defensive positions so they could respond, but nothing appeared to be effective. The forest was obviously too big and too unpredictable for their technology to handle. Come make up for the terrain, their communication gadgets and scanners were made unusable by the dense forest. Were still beset by interference, functioning in the dark and unable to follow their adversaries' desperate attempts. Extraterrestrial commanders had misjudged this human, whatever he was, when they were establishing in. They had believed he would be as readily overcome soon as the other creatures they had encountered. Lost. But this one was unique in that he was making use of the bush in methods they hadn't expected. That his last-ditch strategies would be ruthless, effective, and efficient. In an attempt to drive him out, the commanders gave their soldiers orders to destroy some of the jungle they had set up. Incendiary weapons trying to drive the guerrilla warrior out into the open by lighting the woods and underbrush on fire for a brief period. The thick greenery was consumed by the flames, which also sent thick plumes of smoke into the air. It appeared that their plan was successful because the fire scattered the dense forest, driving away animals and improving the alien situation. With a view of their surroundings, they slowly made their way across the burned remains, their guns ready to engage the guerrilla fighter to come out, but he failed to do so instead. The smoke and fire worked against them, billowed through the air, confusing the soldiers and reducing their visibility to nearly nothing while they choked. Even in flames, the bush remained unpredictable as trees collapsed from the dense vapors. Their footing was shaky and the dense material beneath them began to give way in all directions. The roots of the jungle, which were still present in certain areas, were tripping them up. Abruptly, the guerrilla combatant hit once more. This time utilizing fire to his advantage, he employed the flames as cover, while the others anticipated their action, and the smoke blinded the aliens as he moved closer, setting off more of his traps, and the ground gave way beneath them. The screams of the fallen soldiers pushed a few soldiers toppling into a pit filled with sharpened stakes. The remaining soldiers felt a new wave of fear. They had been so confident that their plan would succeed, but suddenly they understood they had made a crucial error. Rather than clearing things out, the fire had made things worse for them. The guerrilla fighter was allowed further chances to attack, and he moved like a ghost through the fog. Realizing the seriousness of their mistake, the alien commanders, unseen and untouchable, ordered a withdrawal from the blazing area of the jungle, but more had been lost, and the harm was already done. Men to the guerrilla fighter traps instead of their own fire. The jungle had triumphed once more, and this time the flames had done nothing to lessen it. In fact, with the falling debris and other unexpected elements, it had the remaining alien soldiers gathered farther back, away from the fires. As the flaming branches added to the commotion, they were psychologically and physically worn out, and some of the soldiers' previously ordered ranks were in total disorder, had gone rogue, disobeying commands and straying into the jungle in a last-ditch effort to avoid them all. Made it known to the soldiers that the guerrilla fighter was more than simply a regular soldier. He was something even among the aliens. A legend was growing as they whispered to one another that he was a spirit of some sort, a ghost of the jungle itself, dispatched to exact revenge on the leaders for their invasion. Rejected these reports as untrue, but they were unable to deny that their soldiers were beginning to lose faith in the guerrilla warrior. Had evolved from being merely a pain in their side to a symbol of resistance, demoralizing them with every step. The extraterrestrial forces, regardless of what they did or how hard they tried, using their own strategies against them, the jungle too seemed to be able to keep one step ahead of them and never let them catch up. Be on his side each time the aliens believed they had gained headway. The environment changed to hinder the warrior. Understood how to take use of every tree, vine, and shadow. It was as if the aliens' growing fear of the forest served as his weapon, and they were powerless to stop it. Then the extraterrestrial, the commanders realized they couldn't afford to back down because doing so would entail confessing defeat, which would be embarrassing. Couldn't allow them to continue to harbor a flimsy belief that they could prevail in this conflict, even when they knew they were, as they ran out of alternatives. Neither they nor their soldiers knew where the guerrilla fighter would strike next. The commanders told their remaining soldiers to maintain the line because they were too dispersed and disheartened to conduct a successful defense. However, it was evident that the alien warriors were following their commands. Frightened, because they had never faced an adversary quite like this in their prior campaigns on other worlds, were swift and resolute, but in this jungle on Earth, they were up against something they couldn't be defeated. As the day went on, by sophisticated technology or brute force, the morale of the alien warriors kept declining, and some of them publicly questioned their commanders, demanding an explanation for why they were still present. The question of why they hadn't requested further help was actually that the dense canopy of the jungle prevented commanders from communicating with their fleet, despite their best efforts. Due to the ongoing interference in the air, they were left on their own and vulnerable. The guerrilla warrior was patient. He didn't need to rush across the very terrain they had so carelessly underestimated. The longer he kept them in the woods, the more rush he felt that time was on his side. The aliens were already weaker and more desperate as each hour went by, and they continued to make blunders. Exhausted and the bush showing no mercy to the unprepared, the warrior observed from a distance, biting since he had already defeated the alien soldiers psychologically. He didn't need to fight them directly at this point. Were terrified of the jungle, terrified of him, and terrified of one another. He was aware that it was only a matter of time until their dread totally overcame them, and he would be prepared the moment that happened. The only sounds in the jungle were the rustle of leaves from time to time and the distant cry of an animal, but to the every noise and every movement in the darkness was a threat from alien soldiers. The guerrilla fighters were prepared to attack. They were simply waiting. They were already vanquished, though they were unaware of it. Awaiting the last blow to land, and when it did, the alien commanders knew that the forest would be the last thing they saw. Was their final opportunity. They were trapped, cut off from supplies, and faced an adversary who had methodically destroyed their whole enterprise. The jungle had engulfed them, but the true threat was Guerrilla Fighter, who had made the environment into a weapon and was now more numerous than ever. Drastically diminished and their spirits destroyed, the extraterrestrial forces were getting ready for what they thought might be in their last fight. The surviving soldiers established a protective circle and made use of what little had departed to survey the area, but their attempts to find the Guerrilla Fighter had been fruitless, and even when advanced systems were reduced to little more than broken remnants of technology. The commanders remained resolute. Taking a stance meant they had gone too far to turn back, and conceding defeat wasn't an option. An alternative, the bush grew eerily quiet as the men crowded together, grasping their rifles tightly. The whole jungle appeared to be holding its breath. There were no birds, insects, or anything else. The soldiers nervously exchanged glances as they awaited the inevitable, knowing that the horror in their eyes was evident. The fighter could attack at any time and from any angle. However, they were forced to wait for the Guerrilla Fighter, who was moving slowly. He had been observing them for days, knowing that they were at their best when they went into battle, reaching his breaking point, and now he would deal the death blow. His patient's finest asset, and it was now time to complete the task he had begun. The attack's first indication appeared suddenly. A powerful explosion tore through the atmosphere, scattering flying debris as one of the last alien vehicles exploded. The soldiers immediately began to panic as panic swept across their ranks, and they began to run for cover in all directions. The jungle with their rifles drawn, but there was nothing for them to shoot at, because the Guerrilla Fighter had attacked once more. Similar to how he disappeared before they could strike back, the commanders yelled commands in an attempt to keep things under control. But it was too late. The soldiers' formation had broken and they were in disorder. Another explosion ensued, and then another. The fighters had set up traps all around, and now the alien soldiers were stumbling into the precise traps he had devised, fraying nerves. The fighter moved quickly through the confusion, hitting important targets before vanishing into the jungle and leaving no trace behind. The blasts and falling debris distracted the soldiers, preventing them from reacting. To detect him sneaking past their defenses, he demolished supply stockpiles, knocked out communications equipment, and destroyed the alien warriors' last semblance of cooperation. With each deliberate attack, their odds as the soldiers' chances of survival decreased. The alien leaders were losing what little influence they still had over the soldiers. Encountered uncertainty and terror. The jungle, which had before been a barrier, turned into their adversary. The fighter had ensured that each stride they made seemed they were so overcome with fear at every sound they heard that they lost the ability to distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. Trick of the jungle, and the combatant desired it precisely that way. As the hours continued, the alien troops became weaker and the explosions ceased, but the psychological damage was severe. They were unable to get rid of the sensation that they were being hunted and watched. The silence of the jungle was excruciating, magnifying all of their worries and thoughts. The fighter knew he was stuck in a hostile planet with no way out, so he hit again, but with greater force this time. He eliminated some men who had strayed too far from the line, their bodies vanishing into the dents. The remaining soldiers were now gathered in a tiny clearing, trying to hold, before anyone could respond, their territory. But it was useless since the forest was encroaching on them, and as the fighter eliminated them one by one, the commanders realized their situation was hopeless and made one last attempt. In a desperate attempt, they ordered the soldiers to return to the landing zone and called for a retreat, but the fighter had been waiting for this withdrawal, which was precisely what he had expected to happen. When the fighter started to proceed, the soldiers activated the last part of his plan, in which he had placed a number of traps along the only trail that led to the landing zone, and the earth beneath the soldiers fell away as they unintentionally entered the trap. Pits appeared, sending soldiers plummeting into darkness as the jungle appeared to engulf them. The few that avoided the trenches, they encountered further traps, sharp stakes concealed beneath layers of vegetation, and vines that snapped like whips. With lethal precision, falling branches and leaves smashed down at the retreat. Transformed into pandemonium, soldiers' cries could be heard as they fell into the traps. As the leaders realized the full scope of what the Guerrilla Fighter strategy could accomplish, their voices echoed across the jungle. All they could do was watch as their once proud army was reduced to a dispersed, scared rabble. Countless survivors, each one attempting in vain to escape the final wrath of the jungle. The guerrilla warrior, who was observing from the shadows, realized that there were just a few alien soldiers remaining. The conflict was over because he had outlasted, outwitted, and utilized the jungle to destroy them, realizing that they had lost not only the fight but the war. And he could see the defeat in their eyes. Shaken and degraded, the alien leaders could do nothing but issue a request for an evacuation. Their objective had failed. The formerly confident invaders were reduced to a scared, defeated, their previous selves hobbling returned to their landing craft, their efforts in the jungle yielding nothing. Thought would be a simple conquest had turned out to be their downfall as the final alien ships departed. The guerrilla fighter watched them leave, knowing that the jungle behind them would remain silent and dark. When they returned, they had discovered the hard way that this land wasn't theirs to steal. It had always belonged to the people who knew how to survive in the forest, the jungle itself. The forest had reverted to its original form after the aliens left. The trees were softly swaying in the breeze, and the animals had started. Everything underneath it was once again hidden by their sounds in the dense canopy. The fighter's task was accomplished when he vanished into the foliage, soundlessly emerging from sight. The jungle would always be there, waiting for the next idiot to think they could enter, conquer it to defend the forest. Someone was all that was needed, not an army. Someone like the guerrilla fighter, who recognized its strength and knew that as long as they were there, the jungle would never be subdued. The extraterrestrials had arrived on Earth with the idea of bending it to their will, but ultimately they were the ones people were crushed. The forest had prevailed, and the combatant had ensured that it would live on in the memory of all.